rounded back in and get started. Commissioner Teague. All right, we're going to move to the Fisheries Management Committee. Chairman David Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to call Frank Fiss, please.
Good morning. Okay, what I'll be presenting today is the sport and commercial fishing proposals, and if you approve these come October, these will affect the sport fish proclamation, the live bait proclamation, and the commercial fishing proclamation, which actually we'll bring to you in September. The regulation process for sport fishing starts in April when we do our formal request for comments from the public, and that's about a month long. Those comments are shared with our biologists, and then they bring their data and other information to our biologist meeting in May and make their recommendations. Between June and July, there's a lot of back and forth among the regional offices and Nashville, I suppose, about the recommendations to make sure we get them right. Then we bring them to the staff meeting for approval. And then at this meeting, traditionally each year, we present them to you as a preview. And public comment period following this meeting will be through the month of December, ending around October 5th. And then we'll meet again in late October to talk about the sport fish proclamation and the live bait proclamation. First proposals are for Region 1, or for several lakes that have bass fishing in them. They're the first one is Pin Oak Lake at Natchez Trace State Park. Pretty large reservoir. They're looking at doing a slot limit on it and having some pretty high bass creel limit to weed out some of the smaller fish. Now, this is what we're proposing. We also got word very recently that the state park may be doing some maintenance at this dam, and they may drain the lake. Obviously, if they drain the lake, we may be in for another type of a regulation to allow more harvest before they do that. We'll see what happens, and we'll watch that. We'll release this as our plan for the public to see over the next comment period. On beach watershed lakes, Pine Lake, we got a recommendation to do a 10 bass a day creel limit for largemouth bass. And on Dogwood and Budwood lakes, we're looking at a slot limit there with a pretty liberal creel limit of 10 bass. It's pretty common that we want to take a lot of bass out of these smaller impoundments to improve the growth of younger fish and to promote having some bigger fish in these lakes. Switch over to Region 2, we'll talk about trout. The Elk River flows out of Timms Ford Dam, and there's a cold water trout fishery there. Probably the most western one in maybe the country. So it's pretty unique when people come up from Alabama to fish it pretty commonly. We stock it with a lot of rainbow trout, and we stock it with a few thousand brown trout as well. So there's a pretty good harvest fishery for the rainbow trout and not a lot of growth potential out of them. But our brown trout do pretty well in the system. We'll get fish that will approach and exceed 20 inches at times. And that's without any restriction on it. There's no size limit on it now. We'd really like to promote the quality of this fishery and see what we can do. There's not a lot of harvest on brown trout relative to the rainbows, but if they're harvesting just the big fish, it could make a difference to do this. And in 2013, we interviewed the anglers down there. 79% of them were in support of doing a regulation on brown trout to try to promote this fishery and improve this fishery. And only like 1% were opposed, and another 10% were indifferent about it. So we think it's a pretty good idea to try this regulation. Another Region 2 request was for a restriction on grass carp harvest. Now, if you don't know, grass carp are used commonly in small impoundments to manage weeds, and typically people don't harvest a lot of grass carp out of these impoundments, but for some reason in this locality, people like taking these home and eating them, and that's going to be a problem for managing that lake. So we're going to encourage said in the proclamation that they not harvest these fish and leave them alone so they can do the job they were put there to do. Over to Region 3, Region 3 is a couple largemouth bass regulations. On Cordell Hull Reservoir, we're recommending a 15-inch minimum length limit and a 5 bass a day. That's for all the bass species that are in there combined. Over the years, in recent years, we've had slot limits of different types on Cordell Hull, trying to get the most out of the trophy potential of this body of water, and it just has not been successful. So we're backing off and want to go to a 15-inch size limit. And that's the reason for that one. For Parksville Reservoir, they're requesting the same regulation. One thing that's neat about this is by Parksville being a 15-inch minimum length limit, all the lakes in Region 3 will have a 15-inch minimum length limit for largemouth bass. That'll keep things a little simpler. But another good reason to have a higher length limit on largemouth bass at Parksville is that this is the lake that has those invasive Alabama bass that are really notorious for crowding out largemouth bass. So we want to give the largemouth bass that are in there every chance they have by giving them another inch to spawn, essentially, to protect them up to 15 inches. Also in Region 3, there's an active paddlefish sport harvest fishery. This is where people go out and snag these fish. You can't catch them any other way. You've got to snag them with a treble hook or other snagging systems. And in the past, the season is late April through May. In the 2015 season, TWA staff were observing this fishery, and they documented a minimum of 201 paddlefish going home as legal harvest. Then more concern was raised about the number of fish that were getting snagged and then discarded and were probably going to die because of the snagging techniques and such. And at our biologist meeting, we wrestled with what kinds of things we could do to have this discard or catch and release mortality lowered, and we really couldn't come up with a viable solution. The best thing we could recommend was to reduce the creel to 1 fish a day. That would presumably cut the time people would spend there in half and limit the rate of that happening by that mechanism. And there's no culling when if you catch with the 2 fish creel limit, there's no culling as well. But basically, if you snag a paddlefish, you have it on a stringer, you're done. You can't take that off a stringer and put it back in the river. If you catch a bigger one, you can keep catch and release fishing, which we don't encourage, but we're thinking once people get their one and they're done, they'll go home. So. Now on to smallmouth bass on Douglas, Cherokee, Fort Loudoun, and Tellico. Last year, there was a lot of discussion about smallmouth bass regulations, particularly on these reservoirs, and this commission passed rules for Douglas Reservoir, which was a split season protecting bigger fish in the summer months, and that's what happened. We also asked for time to look at Cherokee and Fort Loudoun. We knew we were going to be on a cycle to be looking at those lakes anyway. We just wanted some time to work on them. So that did happen. John Hammonds and his crew were out. They handled hundreds of smallmouth bass out of Cherokee, Loudoun, and Tellico this spring. Mike Bramlett in my division jumped on those otolith samples they used to age the fish and got them done so we could have all this information to talk about at this meeting. They did a great job. Boiling down the data that they collected from the fish falls into a couple categories, just growth rates and mortality rates. What this graph represents is the growth of smallmouth bass, the average smallmouth bass over time. You'll see these fish live up to about 11 years of age. All these populations have the capacity to reach 20 inches. If one of note is Tellico Reservoir, they are growing slower than the other populations. And Loudoun looks to have the ability to produce some big fish and keeping more fish in the population later, so they got some of the older fish compared to those other lakes. We also estimate mortality for these populations, and what that means is we look at the number of fish that are, say, 2 years old, and the number of fish that are through time to the number of fish that are 10 years old, and you get a line. Of course, it's a regression line, but when it says for this first one, for example, Cherokee 2015, that means we estimated the mortality of that population over the last 12 years, and that estimate tells us that on an annual rate, 46% of the fish die each year. Those rates of 46, 49% are pretty typical for, we see that on many other reservoirs. What's of note here is that Fort Loudoun has a pretty low mortality rate, suggesting that 18-inch size limit that's on there is effective, and that's probably why we're seeing so many older fish coming out of Fort Loudoun. We also talked to anglers in this past year. Since the new regulation was put on, they were asked specifically, what do you think of the new regulation? Again, that was the split season that had an 18-inch size limit in the winter, and then a 20-inch size limit in the summer. It looks like with 55% of the people like the concept of a split season and maybe those particular length limits. 16% had no opinion. I would say that that's fairly positive to go forward to say we've got some interest in a split season on Douglas. They also asked a more in-depth survey of people fishing on Loudoun, Tellico, and Cherokee. They wanted to know if they wanted to keep the existing 18-inch size limit, do they want to reduce the creel limit or the length limit, or look at a seasonal limit, or have no opinion. And what's of interest in this, to me, it really shows the difference between Cherokee, Fort Loudoun, and Tellico as a group. The Loudoun and Tellico people are not very interested, or not as interested, in seasonal regulation. On Cherokee, there is interest in a seasonal regulation and a reduced creel. So we, as opposed to being satisfied with what the current is, it's those people are in the minority there. That's what our anglers told us. So our biologist's recommendation is to modify the Douglas split season that was passed last year, and add Cherokee to that because of the similarities between those lakes, and use a October 16th, May 31st timeline to protect the fish over the winter, and allowing up to 50, kind of allowing more handling of fish, because people will be able to harvest them at as early as 15 inches. And that the dates on that are based on actually our Norris Reservoir, which is not one we're talking about today, but if you look at Norris, Douglas, and Cherokee, Norris Reservoir is the coolest. So in the region, they kind of use that as the mark. When that one reaches about 75 degrees around June 1st. So those other lakes are going to warm up even faster. So, and another benefit is these dates also fall in line with the Norris dates exactly. So there's going to be one set of dates to keep up with if you're a smallmouth bass fisherman. So this is the recommendation: 15-inch minimum length limit, 5 a day in the winter essentially, and then in the summertime you're looking at 18-inch, 1 per day. Then also in Region 4, we're doing a minor change to the crayfish regulation. Currently, you're allowed to harvest crayfish for food out of the water bodies in the French Broad, Holston, and Clinch River, but they're allowed to move them around alive in the watershed if they stay within that watershed. And what we're very concerned about invasive crayfish like this Kentucky River crayfish getting out and getting put into the wrong creeks. We've got a bad track record of these crayfish affecting our native crayfish. All we're asking is the people that are harvesting crayfish from these areas, they have to take them dead. So ideally you'd want them alive if you're eating them, but we're asking them to, put them on ice and pinch the heads. We really don't want any crayfish being moved around the state at all. We're trying to meet people halfway, give them some opportunity to take these crayfish for food as much as that happens. Now, if you're bait fishing, and I'm switched over to the live bait proclamation, this will affect the live bait proclamation if you choose to do that. It's the same thing. When people are harvesting crayfish and use them as bait, we want them to stay in the creek or river they're fishing in with that live bait. We don't want them getting in the truck and going over to some other watershed, or even upstream in the same watershed, and putting them out where they don't belong, and they're a real risk to native crayfishes. This isn't a change per se to the live bait proclamation. It's just a clarification that we've left out. We get a lot of sport anglers call and ask if they can sell, particularly skipjack, that they've caught with sport fishing methods for bait, and there's a pretty good market for those fish. They're over $10 a fish at Bass Pro right now. We have a size limit on them, or a creel limit on them right now to address that as well, but we don't want to blur the commercial and sport lines when it comes to the means that are used to harvest fish. So anyway, we just want to make it specific in the proclamation that only licensed commercial fishers and bait dealers may harvest bait fish for sale. So we'll make that clear. And this is about halfway, and I'm about to get into the commercial fishing. If you have any questions about sport fish.
You said 46% of those fish die annually. Is that, Commissioner Watson confirmed that, but that sounds like, is that of a certain age group, or you're telling me the entire population of fish, 46% die every year? That doesn't sound like mathematically it's possible to.
Right. You're starting with potentially millions of young fish when they're spawning out. So it's a numbers game, but what that is the line that, if you draw a line between the number in the population at age, say age 2, or they're first available for our catching with the electric fishing boat, out to the end, that's the mathematical rate that's dropping at. So yeah.
Annually.
It can be of course, it's much higher on a short-lived species like crappie. It could be 60. That's what happens. Fish die.
Seems like you lose.
You think you would run out of fish?
Well, if you lose
soon,
1 year
but
class of fish, if the water level is down or whatever, you lose a whole class of fish. And next year you don't have any recruitment. You lose your whole lake.
Well, right. And
based on that.
They drop at that rate annually. So if you take half and half again, you still have fish out there, no matter how long it goes. But back to the recruitment variability that you're talking about, if you got a really low year class, you're probably going to have better survival of that individual cohort because they don't have as many to compete within their group. What we're reporting when we say annual mortality, it's a historical snapshot of 10 different year classes in the population. It's different than estimating how one group follow through the population. That's a whole different mathematical model. But for what we've been using in our modeling, the annual mortality rate works fairly predictably. But you can only talk about averages, just like your actuarial tables for humans do the same thing. On average, but you could be the guy, you could outlive it all. But yeah, it is that. So.
Thank you guys for looking at Cherokee and Douglas. We appreciate the work you've done on that. I think that's a very good proposal you got there. One thing I would like to see you consider is on Douglas Reservoir. We talked about this last year and it didn't get put into regulations. we have a situation there where right now your dividing line between the lakes and the rivers, you're using the Leadville Bridge. Well, there is a tremendous amount of tournament pressure on Douglas Lake, and there's a ton of folks, including myself, who spend a lot of time in the river fishing. When the lake is at full pull, I can take a bass boat all the way to the Inca Dam. I've had it there many times, and I've had my bass boat up in the Pigeon River before. I would like for us to draw that line, move that line that you've got on your smallmouth from a Leadville Bridge, make the lake limits move to the Inca Dam on the Nolichucky River and the Dixie Highway Bridge, Dixie Highway that runs across the French Broad River and the Little Pigeon River, or the Pigeon River.
How far up the Pigeon River would that run it?
About 3 miles.
I know. I'm just kind of remembering when we put the 20-inch size limit on the Pigeon River, there was a lot of interest in having that as a trophy fishery, and we'd have to gauge how much interest there still is in that. I know it's still a popular fishery.
It is a popular fishery. The problem is if I'm fishing on Douglas, I'm fishing a tournament out of the dam, and I stop at Muddy Creek, and I catch a 18-inch smallmouth on my first stop, and then I want to run up in the river. When I cross that line at Leadville, if I've got that fish in my live well, I'm illegal. I can't have that fish in my possession. That's why I'd like to move that line to the Dixie Highway Bridge.
Can we put that in the recommendations for public comment when we're from this meeting? Then I guess we'll do that.
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you.
This is for Commissioner Baker. Back last fall, you mentioned a pretty well-established tournament on Cherokee. Some dates on it. Are we accommodating those dates?
I would love to see us go I would like to see us stay at June 15th instead of June 1st. There's actually next year, the second weekend would be June the 12th, but that would give us 2 more weekends there before with the tighter restriction. And we don't have any tournaments after the second weekend in June that are of big consequence, and I think that'd be protecting the resource. I really like the idea. At first, I didn't like the Norris system that you wanted to bring to us, but after seeing it, I really appreciate it. And one other thing I want to say, just a big pat on the back to the fisheries guys. July the 23rd, 24th, and 25th at Paris Landing, Bassmasters had their Costa Bassmaster High School Series Championship. 2 boys from Livingston Parish, Louisiana. This was the championship out across the whole United States. They held it in Paris Landing. 2 boys from Louisiana weighed in 15 bass for 3 days that weighed 66 pounds. That was a 4.4 pound average. Also, while that was going on, for the 24th and 25th 2-day tournament, they had the junior Bassmaster National Championship, and that was held on Carroll County Lake. 2 middle school boys fishing in that. I think there was around 30 boats in the tournament. Those 2 middle school boys weighed in 28 pounds of bass for 2 days. Well, what's more impressive, Jacob Bruner from Douglas, Texas, in that tournament caught a bass that weighed 11 pounds and 14 ounces, a new state record out of Carroll County Lake. And the second big bass out of 30 middle school kids was an 8-pound, 10-ounce bass. So a big pat on the back to you guys for doing a good job on that. I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'd like to just ask that the biologist, when y'all are having your meeting and stuff, go ahead and start looking at what we're gonna do with Boone Reservoir with, I know that Bart's been thinking about it, but I mean, we've got, I don't know if the rest of the commission knows, but we've got dam problems that's gonna, create the, after I said it didn't sound very good. We're having problems with our dam that, that are gonna indicate that we're down to river status for 7 years, so I'm not sure what's gonna happen there. I know the fishing right now is probably the best it's been, but it's kinda like drawing it down to the point that they're easier to find, but I'm just saying, I can't imagine us having a good, hatch each year, but because there's no place, there's no structure left to hide, so with that, I know there's been a lot of the stripers are coming up in the rivers farther than they've ever been, and I just want y'all to make sure that there's a good rhetoric with the public about what we're thinking about, what we're going to do, and all to make sure that they understand that we're looking at that closely.
Yeah, the second, what Jeff just brought up, there's stripers in downtown Elizabethton right now, and there's stripers all the way up almost to the Hickory Tree Bridge on the Holston side right now. That's a long ways from the lake. I think we ought to maybe consider reducing our striper stocking program for a few years, because you can sit right there where the cold water comes in to the lake right now at the lake level, and it looks like a bunch of sharks. I can see 40 or 50 at any point in time in any direction I look.
Yes, Bart's been keeping me up to date on what's been going on in these lakes that are coming down, and I know that they've done some adaptive stocking strategies to ease back, and they'll keep watching as they learn more about how warm things are getting and how cold things are staying. We know that the striper will make runs into those rivers even in wet years prior to this, and so far we haven't seen any trout population impact. We'll certainly be out there this March to see what's going on, and we'll have to adapt.
I know Commissioner Baker and I have talked that, since it's going to be down 7 years, there's an awesome opportunity for habitat construction, especially along the TVA shoreline and stuff. And obviously, as that develops, please keep us apprised of that if you would.
We will. I know John Hammonds, our reservoir manager over here, has been working on his reef balls, and you guys are aware of that. There's going to be some good opportunity for that, at least out of this. So a silver lining in this, perhaps. Yeah, John?
Yeah, I'll just tell you that we got a grant from TVA for about $160,000 to do exactly what you're talking about, to do some shoreline development, planting some native grass species and other things that will provide that nursery habitat once the reservoir does reach full pool. And we're also planting some shrubs and tree species, first and foremost on federal land, because that's when the lake goes down, that the private land boundaries recede with the water down to the water. So we have to get permission from the private landowners to do the work there, which we're working on now. I think we got a list of about 10 or 12 people. And we have those flyers out. TVA's published them. We're going to put a poster and have those flyers out at the Great Fair. And it was mentioned at the TVA's public meeting.
You can add me to the list.
Yeah,
As
okay.
a private landowner.
All right, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
All right. If you're ready, I'll go on to
Let's see
commercial.
if any comments from the public on sport fishing? Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. The commercial fishing regulation setting process is a little different. We met with the Commercial Fishing Advisory Committee in June of 2015. Your book says 14, sorry about that. But we did have that meeting, and we covered a lot of bases, and some of those discussions led to the proposals that I'm going to present here in the next few slides. But a couple of their requests we were not able to accommodate. The two major recommendations that CFAC had were to open new waters, Watts Bar, Upper Old Hickory, and maybe rotate that in on some kind of, or have a rotation where they would be open temporarily. This is not a new request. We're still have a lot of reservations about that, and we need a lot more information before we could consider that. The other request that they've made is to add new turtle species, particularly sliders and soft shells. And we have a season for snapping turtle, and we're still gathering information about that. We're not really ready to open up new turtle species. We are making a few recommendations, though. On the Hatchie River, we want to, this recommendation would put the Hatchie River rules back to the way they were in the proclamation prior to the existing one. We changed it, and now we're wanting to change it back because there were some problems arose. The new recommendation would be that nets would have to have a mesh size of 1 inch or smaller, or 3 inches or larger, and they would only be fished from October through April instead of the year-round that is set up in the proclamation right now. We're also going to add a few species to the list of commercially available species. The fathead minnow and golden shiner are also could be sold as live bait. They're on our list of the OK list of fish that can be used for live bait. They would probably be limited to only using dead silver sides for sale because these are invasive species that we don't want to have moved around the state alive. The state law requires that commercial gear have a float, and we spent a lot of time in that meeting over what a float should look like and how big it should be, believe it or not. And we arrived with the help of the committee on these dimensions. The image in the lower left corner is a typical rectangular float that they like to use because they can stack them in the boat and get more in there. It makes sense. And then there's the bullet style that Bobby Wilson's modeling there in the right. That's another typical float that would be acceptable. And the commission asked last year, I believe, to make sure that the gray and black were not acceptable colors, and somehow that got left out, so we'll put that into the proclamation this year as well. Sorry about that. On the Mississippi River, we're going to open the paddlefish season 12 hours earlier to allow them to set nets at noon in the daylight. This is something that was passed for the rest of the state last year, and it was not requested or overlooked for the Mississippi River. It worked really well on the rest of the state this year. People were able to get out in daylight, make sure they weren't setting nets on top of other people. Law enforcement could see what was going on. It's just safer in general. And they would like to see it on the Mississippi River. And I've only spent a little time on the Mississippi River, and I would really rather do that at noon than at midnight. You could hit something. So I'm glad to see that. The other one is, this is just a housekeeping thing. We needed better language to define a gill net. A gill net this is going to be added to the definition, that a gill net may not be hobbled to less than 2/3 the height of the net. What that restricts is, if a gill net is 10 feet tall, stretched out, that what they'll do is tie with strings that are called hobbles every so often that shrink the net so that the net's not tight like a chain link fence. It's actually loose in the water. And that's what they want to do, and that's what they need to do to catch fish. But if it gets hobbled too tight, like if you tied the top and bottom end together, then you would just have this amorphous net out there that would actually be able to catch fish that are much smaller fish than that net size would normally allow you to do. And that's why we want to keep them open at least 2/3. We also talked a lot about turtle traps and different ways you could build them and define them. Here's a couple of examples of turtle traps. The one on the left is a floating cage that I guess they are attracted to the bait. They go in, they don't get out, but they can, at least the net this is floating a little bit, so the turtles that they don't harvest can be released unharmed. And this other hoop net, if it's not set underwater, it'll be okay for turtles too. It's actually a turtle net, not a hoop net. And here's the definition. I wanted to just include it for the public record. I'll let you read it at your leisure. Okay. And lastly, we are going to change one of the fields in our daily commercial roe fish harvest report, and this will ask the wholesale fish dealer to write down the weight of the eggs provided for each fish as they come in. So the commercial fisher brings in a tub of eggs associated with this fish, and they will write that down after they weigh the water weight off of it. And this will give us another tool to validate the egg weight associated with each fish. And they were in that meeting and agreed to do that. So that's what we're going to ask them to do. If there's any questions about the commercial fish?
Mr. Fox.
Are there any commercial fishermen here? You need to write that down. That's a first.
I guess
Ms.
I'm
King?
ignorant on that. I thought last year they talked about when they did those eggs, they were all in together. No? They had to keep
Well,
them.
this will only require the dealer to keep the fish they want they want the fish and the eggs together, so there's no combination of eggs from multiple fish to represent one fish.
I thought they did that on the boat.
The law is they have to keep them separated. That eliminates the possibility of someone catching an illegal fish that had eggs and putting them into another pile associated with a legal fish. Now, once these eggs get to the wholesale dealer and they do this raw weight and they write it down, they can turn around and mix those eggs to make their product the way they need to make their product.
But that fisherman doesn't combine them on the boat.
Nope. Correct, they do not, yes. I just want to confirm.
Any other questions from the commission? Questions from the public?
I guess one.
Would you talk about Dale Hollow a little bit, smallmouth regulations? What do you feel like the current system is working up there?
The word I've been getting from our regional fisheries manager there is that our slot limit that we have there is producing a desired effect of having a lot of fish in the slot, promoting quality fishing, be it catch and release fishing. But it's not one of those lakes where we look at the data and say, well, it's just not working. Why are we doing this? It's certainly meeting that original goal that we set out and worked towards over the last 20 years. I don't know if Mark wanted to add any more. We've had pretty favorable reviews from the public when we've asked them how it's going there as well, I believe. You want to add something?
You might repeat what that goal was set 20 years ago. What are we trying to do?
I think this live. We've the last couple of years we've interviewed our anglers out there with our krill survey and asked them questions about satisfaction ratings, asked them about recommendations, and we've gotten favorable satisfaction ratings in those 2 years. I think last year with, I got a note here, almost 70%, 69.8% satisfied with the regulations as they were. Our slot limit is building up numbers of fish in the upper end of the slot, and we get really good catch rates of fish in that upper end. One of the things that we've noticed as far as the benefits of those fish, you know, in 2012 we had a kill, lost, you know, pretty good number of fish. And we feel like what we've done there with that slot limit is kind of maintained resiliency because we've seen really good year classes produced afterwards. So you get benefits with that slot limit at Dale Hollow that, you know, besides that quality of fishing that you get at the upper end of that slot, you also get a resilient population. So, you know, we feel like based on the results that we've gotten from our angler survey, what our field biologists have seen, that we're doing pretty well with it. And I think we'll all have to, you know, acknowledge that Dale Hollow is a very special place. You know, I think looking at the history of those regulations, interest in doing something up there started about 1986. And the evolution of the management there has been in response to what dock owners and people that fish the area have wanted there. So we feel like we're in a good place with it. And I know that, to some degree, the measurement, kind of what you're talking about as far as has it worked, you kind of measure it as how many fish are getting over that slot. And really the slot is set up so that you kind of maximize that lifespan of a smallmouth. So you're getting 8 to 10, 11 years, which is similar to what we saw in that last graph. So it's comparable with other reservoirs. So it's a question of how does that slot limit work? And from the region, we feel like it does. So that's what I have.
You got that slide you could bring up on that. I mean, is the age difference going to be much different? You don't think it's pretty fairly close?
It's going to be close.
All right. So my question is, if you went from that 16 to 21, if you changed your limit to two fish at 18, would you have a heart attack?
I would have concern about changing it without vetting that through the public as
Is that not what we're here to do today?
No, that's not, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. No. Not going back to a 2-fish 18-inch limit, which is where we were at 1992.
Well, there's a tournament trail they have up there every week, and they've, they weighed in this whole year, Jim?
I don't think they've weighed in 4.
Four.
That's over 21.
It definitely affects tournament fishing.
And the thing,
for sure.
and the thing about it is the 21-inch fish that they are weighing in are so far down the hill, they're weighing in the high 2s and 3-pound range. So but you're cutting the economy of you're cutting the economy of selling more license and getting more revenue dollars coming in, and probably losing license sales.
You can download and install the app via Samsung app.
Well, at least we got that cleared up.
Yeah.
I think that balance between, I think when we go that direction, if that was a proposal.
Let me ask you this question. If you did the same deal that we're doing, we started with Norris and we moved it to Douglas last year, we're doing it to Cherokee. If you went from a June 15th to October 15th, 1/21, so we're definitely protecting that hot weather fish, which I told you I agree with completely, and went with two 18s during the cooler months. Do you feel like we would have a profound impact on the resource?
I think there's potential for it. I think it would change the quality of the fishing. To what degree, I can't answer that at this point. But also would like to kind of add that in response to your first question about tournament fishing versus just standard sport fishing, I mean, that place is pulling a lot of people in. So I think we would need to look at, what's the benefit of enhancing tournament fishing versus the people that we're bringing in now. So it's something that, because it is so important to the local economy, we would need to make sure that we weren't focusing on one group of stakeholders at the cost of others. So I think you would want to move cautiously with changing things right now up there, especially since the results of our surveys really don't lend to moving in a different direction at this point. So that as well would make me want to move more cautiously.
Can we ask for public comment?
We could incorporate it into our survey next year, through the year. I mean, last year we were able to interview 517 anglers last year in 2014. That's a pretty good number. That's a robust sample size. And if we ask a specific question, I would want to go through that whole process again. And I mean, it's one of those things, I don't want to rush through it, you know. We've got a really good fishery there. We've got a resilient smallmouth population and really good fishery. So, you know, I'd want to get that information. I don't want to rush through it.
Well, you're not seeing the 6 and 7 and 7.5 and 8 pound smallmouth that were there when you had the 18-inch size limit, for the simple fact that you've got so many fish ganged up. You've
At the top end of that slot.
At the top end of that slot. You've cut out the opportunity with the slot for a fish to ever get back to a state record, to a 9, 10, 11, 12 pound smallmouth, because we've got so many up there, and you've cut out a lot of economic ability for those folks up there in that area to fill their motel rooms, bring out-of-state anglers in, bring biogas, fill restaurants because of this slot limit, in my opinion. I don't think, in my opinion, that if you went to, I'm talking about 2 18s versus 1 over 21 and 1 under 16, or 2 under 16 like you have now. If you went to 2 smallmouth, I feel like you'd be meeting in the middle by still protecting the resource because normally we're at a 5 fish limit. We would still be restricting it to 2 and 2 over 18. Please consider that.
Okay. I would like to say that the move from the 2 fish, 2 at 18, that was established in 1992, changed in 2000, you know, we had public support for that. I mean, we had that. And there's a significant number of people that are still traveling to Del Hollow. I don't think we can discount the conditions that we've got there now as far as the economy and what's happening there. So, you know, unless you have, you know, some information about dollars generated, we see a lot of people, and we get economic data from our creel that tells us that it's still a pretty big driver, and it's doing pretty well. So it's you know, if that's the wishes of the commission for us to survey folks, I'd want to go through the process that we've been doing and ask them, survey the dock owners, and like I said, just move what, you know, there's not a rush to go do this.
I agree.
Can I ask a question? What was the original goal in establishing it? And I don't know enough about it. I'm just inquiring. What was the original goal in going to the, were we trying to maybe see if we could grow another state record or world record fish?
You know, I don't think it was to grow another state record, but it was to enhance the quality of fishing, to make it as good as it could be. So the goal of, that goal of breaking that smallmouth record, that's...
Well, I know the lake has changed, and it's not as fertile as it used to be, and it's interesting, and what made me think of that was...
It's actually more fertile than it used to be. That's the
kinda
problem
picked up
with the
a little bit.
smallmouth.
Well, that's not the information the biologist told me, so I guess I need clarification on that. 'Cause
Well-
when it was new, when the state world record was caught there, it was a brand-new lake, so it was very fertile.
It was.
And now it's matured, and it's not as fertile. Is that not right? I don't know.
Reservoirs typically, as they age, are less fertile. There's probably some embayments in some places where you're getting some nutrient inputs that...
What I'm getting at is that it's not as clear. It's got more weeds. It's just maturing into a older lake. That, I've fished it for years, and you catch a lot more smallmouth down there than you did 20 years ago. And they're usually in that slot, but if you're just going down there to catch fish, you have a lot better time now, because I remember, you know, you might have caught bigger fish 10 or 15 years ago, but you was catching one a night, maybe, and now you're catching 15 or 20. And you got to turn back, but still, makes the
It's
night
some good
makes
fishing
the
there
night
right
go
now.
by a lot
I mean, it's-
faster.
You know, and really, I'm gonna finish this question. Overall, you've got less production in the reservoir, but there's a lot of good habitat. So, you know, reservoirs typically, that's the direction they go as far as productivity. And Commissioner Baker, I would, you know, in managing fisheries, you've got habitat, fish, and people. So it's really, and it's kind of a moving target sometimes to understand what the majority of stakeholders out there really expect from the resource. And, you know, it's like Commissioner Bledsoe just mentioned, you get some really good catches of fish in that upper end of that slot. So, you know, we need to keep that in mind, that you're getting some really good catches of fish. Now, it does affect tournaments, no doubt. But, you know, need to balance that out, and like I said, not rush forward with a place like that, because it is a very special place, and it means a lot to the local economies. And so I think we're good, but we can keep asking those questions and keep a finger on the pulse of what the attitudes of the people using the reservoir are.
I agree with you 100%. It's absolutely a special place. All I'm thinking is that if we went with what I'm recommending to you, it would still be the most restricted smallmouth fishery in the state by far.
Any other questions?
If I may, no more questions for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
I thought it might be appropriate, before we get out of fisheries, I know Mayor Harrison's been very patient.
Okay.
Sitting through the whole, and I know you have a request to at least propose to the commission about concerning the Clinch River. If you stay up there, Frank, I think it'd be good.
Hancock County has two rivers, Clinch and Powell, and we've been asked, I think we've been a part of a private act for how many years?
First enacted that I'm aware of, 1953.
And it restricts or limits the use of hoop nets, or nets, period, I think is the problem. It's been brought up in our county commission meeting several times, and I know we're probably behind, or maybe asking ahead of the fact, because we need to go through the proper channels. But it's been considered, or we have been asked to consider, net fishing back in the Clinch and Powell rivers. So could you answer how we need to go, or what we should do to
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of new to me, this topic, just in the last day or so, so forgive me if I'm not totally briefed on it. But I read the private act, and my understanding is that that's not in effect anymore. Is that the model that you're going to go forward with? Because it's pretty vague. It just says nets. And, there's a lot of different kinds of nets, so we'd want to know. I guess what our staff is interested in is, a pretty specific proposal. What kind of gear are you talking about? When, where, what kind of harvest? Just so we have something to consider more specifically. And ideally, the process would start back in April, where we could get the public comments, but, it'd be up to the commission if they want to work on that.
And we were aware of that. I've talked to Mr. Carter. He's been to it. They've talked with our county commission. We know that we need to propose and have it drawn up and submit to you earlier in the spring, so we know that we're outside of timeline. But, we were there, and this young man was also at our county commission the last time. He's assisting us, and that's the reason we're here today, so that we could get some closure on this and also find out some good information for our anglers in Hancock County.
The other thing, it would be if when you guys consider what exactly you want, you just to be aware that there is a slap basket of opportunity for sport fishermen. That's what happens in the rest of the state and in Hancock County now. So just that would be we would like something that's similar to everywhere in the state, if we could do that.
Are you proposing it for just the Clinch or the Powell also?
Clinch and Powell.
Clinch and Powell?
Mm-hmm.
Could I speak,
Please do.
Commissioner?
Sure, just tell us who you are.
Yeah, I will. With the chairman's permission, I've only been retired 11 years, and I'm a little uncomfortable talking to you with my back to these guys. Somebody should be mad at me. If I can go over and stand by Frank. I want to keep my eye on that crowd back there. Bob Ripley, retired TWRA, and it's kind of like coming home for me. I retired in '04. That commission meeting in 1986, I was there when the smallmouth rigs were put on Del Hollow Lake. And that was the most, I guess, volatile commission I ever sat through. In fact, the chief of law enforcement had to get between sport fishermen on Del Hollow that were opposed to that and the commissioner, because blows were fixing to occur. And I'm talking about Babe Howard. Some of you in West Tennessee know Babe Howard. He kind of looked over the World Series of Little League Baseball down there in Millington, and he built the ball field down there for the World Series of Little League Championship. But anyway, he was at just like you all sitting behind the table, and this fisherman got up and come to the microphone, and he said, "This is a rubber stamp." The budget committee mentioned rubber stamp. This was all cut and dried before this meeting today, and said, "Commissioner Howard, you slept through the whole meeting. You didn't listen to anything that was said." And his chair went over backwards. He came around the end of the table, and he said, "Will you see what I know about this?" And the chief of law enforcement got between the fisherman and the commissioner, or there would have been blows exchanged. So
This is why I sit next to Trey T.
good idea. To understand fishing in Hancock County, you have to look backwards a little bit. My wife and I retired and moved to Hancock County and bought a farm in 2002. And I moved over there because my heart is in wildlife and fish. There's two beautiful clear rivers over there that are full of smallmouth, and I love to fish for smallmouth. There was excellent grouse hunting. I have bird dogs, I'm a grouse hunter, and there's excellent wild turkey hunting. So I'm a proud resident of Hancock County. Back in the late 80s, I was the regional manager sitting right where John is now. And one of my friends is here today, Mike McCoy. Mike, would you hold your hand up? Resident of Hancock County. He lived over there. He was disturbed. They weren't catching any fish. So he got up a petition and went around all over the community. And this private act, if you don't know what a private act is, when I was regional manager, we had about 15 raccoon seasons. We had about 20 red fox seasons. You couldn't kill foxes in most counties because the fox chasers bought those foxes and brought them in and turned them loose, and they wouldn't let hunters trap them or shoot them. And this was all done by the county court. Now I've got the fishing guide in my hand. So you had private acts you couldn't hunt on Sunday. Hancock County proposed a private act that non-residents could not hunt big game the first 30 days of the hunting season. Should be restricted to residents only. Now what's that do for your revenue? Well, the Tennessee Conservation League said, this is crazy. We got 150 private act seasons all across the state. None of them's printed in any literature. Since the Game and Fish Commission weren't in charge of that, they didn't put it in the hunting guide. The counties weren't able to get the word out. The game wardens didn't, and I was one. We didn't know what the season was. The public didn't know what the season was. So the judge had to sort all that out. So it was a mess. So the Conservation League sued the agency in the state of Tennessee. The former wildlife commissioner, Bill Willis of Nashville, represented the Tennessee Conservation League. And they sued TWRA and the General Assembly that what you're doing is unconstitutional. You established this commission, and I'm a fond, true believer in the commission process. It's worked great for the state of Tennessee. It's worked great for the U.S., and it's the way to do game and fish business. So I thank you all for your service. Anyway, they sued, and it was a long court. There's members of TWRA staff. I don't know if Doug Scott's still here. Doug He was our small game biologist in Region 4. He testified in that lawsuit. But it drug on for days, and finally the judge come back and said, the General Assembly is all powerful. It's just like God. They established the commission. They established the laws that set up the commission. In their wisdom, if they feel like when they hear from their senators and representatives a tweak or something needs to be done, that's in their power. Probably not the most advisable thing to do, and we recommend that county courts not do that, but it's not unconstitutional, so they left those intact. But over time, most of those have been done away with. Dorothy Necessary and the commission addressed the loyalty of our employees. Dorothy Necessary was hired as a secretary in 1974 when this agency was changed from Game and Fish to the Wildlife Agency. So she's been here, with the exception of a little time raising babies, for 41 years. She was raised in Hancock County. There's a hoop net hanging in the lobby out there over her desk that her dad tied with his own hands. He built his own boat, and there's been a lot of documentaries on Jap Mackey. He was a pioneer in Hancock County. When that law went into effect, we were just coming out of World War II, right on the heels of the Depression, and there was no industry, no jobs over there. People were hungry. So the General Assembly gave them a hoop net, and it said only residents of Hancock County could fish these nets, one net per household. You could not sell the fish. You could not keep any game fish. The problem with that is that when the law was written, it just said net. It didn't say hoop net. By agency policy, we game wardens were instructed to drag them rivers every spring and pull all them nets out. They had to have the name and address of the owner. But people weren't fishing hook nets. They were fishing gill nets and trammel nets, because that's how you catch fish. You catch few fish in a hook net, but not like you would with a gill net. And a gill net goes around the fish's gills. He can't move, and if you're not there quick, you're going to die. So there's a lot of mortality with the gill and trammel nets that you don't experience with a hook net, because he's kind of like he's in a big old sock in there swimming around and around. And you let the game fish out and take the catfish home and eat them, or whatever else that's rough fish that you want to eat. And over there, they still gig for suckers and in the spring, and they can those and make fish patties and things out of that for food. But Mike and the fishermen over there thought that private act was hurting the sport fish, and they wanted walleye put back in the river. So they got their state representative to call me and said, if we get the county court to repeal that private act for our county, would TWRA look into reestablishing a river-run walleye? Now, Norris Lake is on the lower end of the Clinch and Powell. They come together over there at Chuck Swan Wildlife Management Area, two rivers. And it's, I won't say full of walleye, but they don't migrate up the rivers anymore. So Wayne Pollock, chief of fish, contracted with Arkansas to swap a product we had in our hatcheries, which was striped bass, for a river-run Greer's Ferry walleye. And I know Bart's researched that some, but for about 3 or 4 years, we were able to get river-run walleye and took them up to Kyle's Ford. But the fishermen came to the agency and said, we will do away with that net. But how Dorothy comes into this little story is her dad was about 90 years old, and Dorothy was my secretary, and her dad had hand-tied that net, and she'd seen her dad down on that river, and it's part of his life. And so I said, Dorothy, I'd like to go talk to your dad, your mom. So that was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. And I went to his barn, and that net that's hanging out there in the lobby was hanging in that barn. I told him what the agency had been asked to do. And I said, the fishermen want that. And he said, well, Mr. Ripley, I'm too old to fish these nets anymore. But he said, my grandson and I are building that net, he and I, Dorothy's son, and I wanted him to experience what I've experienced. I've been a strong defender of steel traps, hunting bear with hounds, the traditional things that we do. Sometimes even hunting with a bow, you know, is that humane? You have to bleed that deer out. I think if it doesn't hurt the resource, we ought to allow it. Now, since I moved to Hancock County, I get questions in the grocery store. Very rural county, small population, and people know who you are. And they said, Ripley, what's your problem with them nets? What's your problem with the hoop net? And I usually just pass that off. But I went to the county court meeting. I called Jeff last Monday. And it's like Thomas said, been rolling on for 3 or 4 years now, that there's about half the commission feels like the landowners want that put back in, and we were not successful in getting a river run walleye population up there. Mike is an excellent guide. He don't charge anybody anything, but he's fished that river all his life, and he's a good grouse hunter, and we're real close personal friends. Well, what I told the commission last Monday night is, Bob Ripley, I don't have a problem with the hook net. What I had a problem with was private legislation. It's your all's job to set the hunting and fishing regulations. And I asked the county court, I said, if you want to do this, and the biologists say the hook net doesn't hurt the resource, come over there and ask the commission to do that. The old law said residents of Hancock County only. I don't think that will fly anymore. If you're going to have a loophole, it's going to have to be for everybody. And if a hook net is approved by the fisheries section of this agency, then I would like for the commission to take this under advisement. Now I think the problem is that right now the county commission is pretty much split 50-50, and they've got to come up with a 2/3 majority. But I don't want to go back into that private act situation. So we're here today. I think Thomas is asking for direction. When John and Bart came to the commission meeting over there last fall, they asked the county court to put down what you want in writing and send it to us early spring. We'll take it to our fisheries planning meeting, and we'll see if the staff will buy into this, and maybe we can bring it forward. Well, most of those county commissioners don't fish. They're farmers, a mortician that owns a local funeral home, and so they're being torn now by the people that want to put the hook net back in the river. And I don't have a position either way, but I just asked Thomas to bring this before you all and get your direction. So, and I know Dorothy's son still has a hook net, and hoop nets are legal commercially. Whether the definition that you all have in the proclamation for a commercial hook net is the same kind that that the county court would want, but and the county lawyer over there says until we get the county commission to vote with a 3/4 majority or whatever, we don't even really have a proposal to take and ask them to do. But I guess we're out here today asking if the county court decides which way we're going to go, will the commission entertain this as a agency legislation rather than going to the state representative senator route. So, if anybody had any questions of me, I'd try to answer them, but that's kind of where I'm at in the thing.
Well, I'm not speaking for the commission, but I personally appreciate you making the phone call, because it's something we'd rather you propose to the commission versus going to the legislators. And obviously, if you have a majority vote and y'all decide to do it, then we need a specific proposal and to bring it to us, and obviously the agency will review it and certainly will entertain it. Do you know how many county residents do you think right now that are interested in using these hoop nets?